Today is December 15th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Yo, chillin'. Rockin' Subathon, we're on day 15? Day 14? 14.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Is it working out all right?
Yeah. We got 2 hours 30 on, so people have been very hype supporting us today. I just did a Twitch bounty. I don't know if you saw the game that I was playing, but it's called The First Descendant. So they sponsored an hour of that, which was cool.
Oh, that's pretty neat. Any good?
Yeah, it's got a really nice aesthetic for the environment. The characters are more of like the hottie archetype than some other games, so there's some pull for that reason. It's a Korean-made game.
Of course.
And also, we have a special reveal this week, thanks to Dragorif. We have 2 Agent Smith emotes now that people can use. It's Agent Smith from The Matrix, and he's either putting on sunglasses or taking them off. So people have options. Depending on if you say something really thought-provoking or whatever, they can use one of those emotes to punctuate it and emphasize what's going on. So expect to see some of that in the VOD chat. It looks very good. They turned out great.
Cool.
Yep. So now chat thinks you are Hugo Weaving.
Uh-oh. I'm not nearly so charismatic.
I just looked it up. I didn't know that he was V in V for Vendetta. I found that out today. Yeah.
Yeah, you never actually see his face, so...
Yeah. It's just his voice.
Well, I'm a little tired, and I don't have a whole lot for this week, so we might do a truncated episode today.
That's totally fine. Stay safe, take care of yourself. Well, it's probably not as ridiculous of a week as last week. Last week was kind of like everything hitting the fan at once.
Yeah. Yeah, last week was a very high bar, and this week did not clear it. Which is a good thing. You don't want crazy weeks like that happening all the time. So we should be grateful.
Can I ask about a random country that I thought of because I saw a song named after it?
By all means.
How's Tunisia doing?
Not so good. Not so good. Yeah, they had, maybe I shouldn't say everybody, but the Arab Spring happened in 2011. There was a number of uprisings in the Arab world. A lot of people attempted to try to force their governments to become more democratic. And results were pretty mixed. And after a few years, the only success story from the Arab Spring was Tunisia. And so people had been keeping an eye on Tunisia to see how Arab democracy worked out, because it seemed like they were the principal example in the region. And for about 10 years, they were doing okay. But they had a lot of problems. Not least of which was political infighting, for one, no surprise. But also, more importantly, they were largely unable to resolve the economic problems in the country that had actually been the principal impetus behind the 2011 uprising in the first place.
What were those problems?
High unemployment, inflation, low economic growth, just general lack of opportunities, to say nothing of just general corruption, parasitic authorities. If you remember, the Arab Spring started in Tunisia because there was a guy selling, it was like fruit or something off of a cart, who was getting hassled by the police. They were demanding bribes, basically, as a condition for not just confiscating his cart. And when he refused to pay, they took it, and he basically just lost his livelihood. That was his main source of income. And he decided to self-immolate. He set himself on fire in protest, and that was the first domino in a chain reaction that ended in the overthrow of several governments in the region, as well as the change, more peaceful change of some others. So a pretty wild series of events, but it was that economic dislocation that was caused by general bad conditions in the country that led to that guy being in a position where he was just heavily dependent on that one cart, as well as particularly vulnerable to parasitic authorities that were basically stealing from him. Mm-hmm. And people were very hopeful that if they could just get rid of the Ben Ali dictatorship, which governed the country at the time, then things would improve in that regard. And there have been improvements, but not nearly as broad-based as people wanted. The rural areas in the country in particular have not seen virtually any improvement, at least last I'd read. So the country was seeing an increase in disenchantment with the democratic experiment over time. It didn't really seem to be delivering the promises that it had made initially. And eventually, in the most recent presidential election, which was several years ago now, I don't recall exactly when it was, but there was kind of a stark choice between a reformist candidate who was promising to kind of shake things up, but otherwise try to preserve Tunisian democracy. And then his opponent was a kind of a populist guy who was making big promises and using a lot of low effort, cheap rhetoric to try to get people on his side. And there was a lot of concern about what would happen, if people sprung for the populist. There was hope that people would go reform, but there was also a sense that people were very cynical and didn't really have much patience for people who were saying that, democracy is hard, but it's worth it to keep it. So the twist ending there is that the reformist candidate actually beat the populist candidate and then promptly became a de facto dictator.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was not the ending people were hoping for. Pretty disappointing. And
why did they do
that? You would really have to ask the president in question. He's the only one that can say for sure. His reasoning basically is that Tunisia needed strong leadership in order to cut through all of the political infighting that was causing stagnation in the legislature. Nothing was getting done in the legislature because it was basically deadlocked. And so he believed that there needed to be a strong executive in control of the country's affairs to get past that and actually implement changes, which he did. He did successfully circumvent the legislature and then kind of promptly, conveniently forgot to do all of the actual reform stuff. Go figure. Yeah, most of his attention over the past 4 years, however long it's been, has been more on suppressing dissent. He's not a totalitarian dictator. He's kind of more in the Orban side of things, right? He's worse than Orban. I don't want to oversell the point, but he is authoritarian. Mm-hmm. It's a softer form of authoritarianism, but there's not really free and fair elections. He's leaned very hard on the legislature to do what he wants, and he's put a lot of pressure on political dissidents and the leaders of opposition political parties. A lot of them have been intimidated, some of them have been arrested. It's very clear that freedom of speech is not really present in Tunisia since he has kind of imposed his will on the country. And that's kind of where they've been at. I haven't read an update in a while, so I'm not sure what's changed in the past year or two. But the last I checked, he was still in power and was kind of just still hanging on. And I don't think he's really solved anything, near as I can tell. So, unfortunately, the one success story from the Arab Spring seems to have failed. So that kind of suggests the whole project has largely been a failure to generate real change in the region, although that does not mean that the Arab Spring was not impactful and that it did not set a foundation on which could be built future change. So there is some hope there. And it's not as though the reformist sentiment that was unleashed in the Arab Spring has disappeared. It's just been violently suppressed by one or the other authoritarian government. Mm-hmm. I actually read an interesting take a couple days ago suggesting that given that Assad was overthrown recently, as we talked about last week, it could be that Syria actually becomes the success story of the Arab Spring. that kind of depends on how the new government shakes out. That still has yet to be negotiated between all the interested parties there. But if they do make it work, and they do have a semi-functioning government that is at least somewhat representative and liberal in nature, it could be that Syria actually does kind of fulfill its potential as a potential success story from the Arab Spring. Because keep in mind, the civil war started in the Arab Spring. Like, it was mass protests against Assad in 2011 during the Arab Spring that sparked the civil war in the first place. So, if the opposition actually does successfully achieve all of their goals as set out in 2011, yeah, maybe we could look at Syria as the example that we used to look at Tunisia as.
Interesting.
But
It's
still
way later than when we consider the Arab Spring to have started, but it can be kind of a domino effect where it paves the way for other stuff and inspires people and so on.
Yeah, that's a long, grinding road to go down to actually achieve the change that was desired in 2011. But, hopefully it works out for them. I mean, they've certainly earned it by this point. If anybody on Earth deserves some peace and quiet, it's the people of Syria at this point.
Mm-hmm. Random question from chat. What is the most boring country?
Well, it really depends on how you define boring. I mean, what would you, Neuro, consider to be boring in a country?
I would say there aren't really that many eventful things that occur. I would probably say it has to be a country that's either low population or extremely low population density. There's not too much to do. Things aren't really developing very fast. It's kind of same routine and not very many people, not much to talk about. Maybe that would be per capita though, because it's not really fair for a smaller country to just be boring because they have less people per se.
Okay. I would say by that definition, some of the micro-states in Europe would probably qualify because they're very small. There's not a lot of economic dynamism. They don't really change that much, and there's not a lot that happens in them. So, have you ever heard of Andorra?
Sounds familiar, but I don't know much about it.
It's a tiny, tiny country that straddles the border between Spain and France. It's in the Pyrenees Mountains. I hope chat can keep me honest. I might be misnaming the mountain range in question, but yeah, it's between Spain and France. There's kind of a weird condominium arrangement between Spain and France to not govern it directly, but basically to mutually recognize its independence and also defend the territory. So it just kind of sits there doing nothing as a result. Nobody makes a move to annex it, but neither does it really have the population or natural resources or anything else to really do more than just be the answer to a trivia question.
Mm.
I'm sure there's some interesting tourism there, but you could probably walk across the whole country in like an hour or two. So I don't think there's going to be a whole lot to actually do if you do go there, other than take pictures. I think Liechtenstein is another one.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of that one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ulrich von Liechtenstein from A Knight's Tale. Mm-hmm.
Well, Liechtenstein is between Switzerland and Austria. It shares a border with both. And it's just another one of those. It's basically just a leftover from a previous period of Europe's history when there was a lot of principalities and these duchies, little tiny territories that were kind of pseudo-independent and kind of not, feudal politics made it all very complicated. And the vast majority of those little territories were eventually absorbed into the nationalist states that were emerging in the 19th century. But there were a handful that were not. Andorra's one, Liechtenstein is another one. And, Switzerland and Austria don't give a shit, so everybody just kind of leaves them alone, and they do their own thing. Again, these are like tiny, tiny states. They are technically fully independent and sovereign, but they're just like towns, basically. Have you ever heard of San Marino?
Yes. That one I've heard of. Monaco
Yeah.
I've heard of.
Monaco is famous.
Yeah, Monaco is not boring though because there's too many famous people in fancy cars driving around all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Doesn't quite meet the criteria you outlined.
Yeah.
But yeah, San Marino is one. That's in Italy, for those not familiar. And yeah, the Italian state never annexed them. They technically recognize their independence. I think there is kind of like a protectorate type arrangement in place, but otherwise they just kind of do their own thing. I guess the Vatican doesn't really count, though. That's kind of a special category of independent state.
Yeah, they have some religious significance, so a lot of people either have a fascination with it because it's their religion or a conspiracy about it because they've controlled information for many years and they have artifacts and stuff, or they're just weird, hokey religious people who are strange, depending on your take.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is more stuff to say about the Vatican. Someone was asking, is the Iraqi democracy not good enough?
Not good enough? And I'm not sure what's meant by that. I mean, that's very much a subjective question. If you're asking, like, in terms of Arab Spring, Iraqi democracy did not originate in the Arab Spring. It originated in the U.S. invasion in 2003. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a different category. If you're asking whether or not that qualifies as a democratic success story in the Arab world, not really. I mean, that kind of depends on your perspective, but there's a lot of problems with Iraqi democracy that have made it semi-dysfunctional. It's more functional than some, like Syria, for example. But that's not saying much. The hopes people had for democratic government in the region were for like functional states that were democratic. But Iraq's state is just plagued by foreign interference, not just by the West, but Iran especially intervenes heavily in Iraq. Some of the most powerful political parties in Iraq are the political parties that are representing the militias that were formed to fight Islamic State back in 2014, 2015. They were called the Popular Mobilization Units. And of course, they became popular because they were seen as defending the country in a crisis, that being the Islamic State invasion. But they were also heavily funded and tied to the Iranian government. And while they were popular during the war with Islamic State, afterwards they came to be seen more and more as just proxies of a foreign government. But they're also important sources of patronage, and one of the principal economic activities in Iraq is the distribution of patronage. It's very hard to find a job. The last I checked, unemployment was still very high, and it's pretty hard to make a living there. They do have a lot of money from oil, but the royalties that are distributed to the population only go so far. So a lot of people want opportunities to work, get ahead, advance, but a lot of people, especially the younger population in Iraq, can't do that. And they find themselves increasingly dependent on this, that, or the other political party or militia to pay them, basically to support them. And that becomes a principal avenue, not only for money, but for advancement, since you can progress through the organizational hierarchy and make more money if you're sufficiently loyal. So because of that, politics in Iraq is very partisan and tribal, and not tribal in like, a traditional tribal sense, but like politically tribal. There's an immense amount of partisanship between these different groups that are trying to get access to the oil money, which is like the main source of revenue in the government. And it makes it very difficult to do anything. Everybody tries to sabotage everybody else. The coalitions are very fluid and unstable. Individual political parties don't really stand for ideas. They're really more just vehicles for powerful people to try to lead and distribute patronage. And that means that if you do, for example, let's say that you're a low-ranking guy, a relatively low-ranking but senior member of one of these political parties. If you get sufficiently popular among your constituents in whatever area you're operating in, you actually have an incentive to break off and form your own party and do your own thing, because you can be your own boss at that point. You can get access to patronage and distribute it and make more money for yourself than you were making just as a flunky within somebody else's patronage network. And so that makes it hard to build like stable coalitions, because even the individual political parties will fracture at a local level. It's actually not that different than South Asia in that sense, but that's a whole other conversation. But the point is that Iraqi democracy kind of struggles to deliver functional governance, and that's kind of been the factor that discounts it as a example to follow in the region. You know, a lot of people kind of point to it as an example of how not to do democracy in the region. I would point out one of the problems with Iraqi democracy, beyond the corruption, you know, the poor governance and the poor economic policy rather, is that it also has a sort of political culture that was heavily influenced by Lebanon. And that's not because of direct involvement by Lebanon, rather, but it's just because when the United States was trying to help the Iraqis, quote unquote, help the Iraqis design a new government, it was thought that the best way to do it was to have some kind of institutional, some kind of institution embedded in Iraqi governance to manage all of the different sectarian groups in the country that were not getting along, principally the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis. And Lebanon, and it has a similar sort of sectarian setup where there's a lot of different sectarian groups, and it was thought that maybe they could have some kind of arrangement similar to Lebanon, where there's an informal agreement that certain parts of the government should be led by leaders from this, that, or the other particular sectarian group. And it was thought that that would result in more stable relations between the different sectarian groups and their various constituents. The trouble with that, as anybody familiar with Lebanon knows, is that it basically institutionalizes and makes permanent sectarian rancor, right? Really, you should be trying to encourage people to see themselves as a member of a single national group, not separate members of different competing groups within the country. And Lebanon has been hobbled by specifically that, basically throughout its history as an independent state since the early 20th century. Once that system was implemented in Iraq, they had very much a similar problem. You know, relations between Kurds, Shias, and Sunnis were probably better before that than they were after, because they were not directly competing against each other generally. That's not to say that they didn't have reasons to dislike each other before. They did. Saddam Hussein was largely himself basically the head of a large Sunni patronage network. You know, it was mostly his hometown and the Sunni regions of Iraq that benefited from his rule disproportionately. So the Shias in the southern part of Iraq obviously didn't like that. So, you know, there's some reason for rancor just because of that. But even so, with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been better just to try to avoid the whole Lebanon solution. It's not been productive. So that's another reason Iraqi democracy is flawed. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's not, the problem isn't that it's not sufficient, you know, because that's kind of ambiguous. The problem is just specific flaws in the design of Iraqi political institutions, and the political culture in the country in general has not been conducive to good governance. And that's really the fatal flaw there. If they had done better in terms of governance, then yeah, you could arguably point out Iraq as being like a good example of what's possible in the Arab world as far as democratic governance, but that's not what happened. You know, they're still working on it. It's still a freer country than most of its neighbors in many ways, but they've got a long ways to go before they can like be fully independent as a sovereign, such that there would be less pressure on the government to put, you know, the interests of various patronage networks before the national interest. Getting past that is like the big challenge for them. If they could do that, there would be significantly more upside, but you know, right now they're just in the middle of struggling with that. I don't know if you remember, but back in 2019, there was a whole series of protests around the world in a multitude of different countries, and Iraq was actually one of them. There was a number of youth protests in the country at that time, specifically against the stuff that I'm talking about, against the patronage, the corruption, the foreign influence, etc. And the response by, you know, the leaders of the different political parties that were benefiting from the status quo was to basically sick their goons on the protesters. There was a number of shootings and killings that happened, as well as assassinations. specifically because of those mass protests. So, the system fights back in Iraq. There are people that try to take advantage of the relative freedom of Iraq to try to fight for a better future, but the institutionalized actors in the political system have resisted that violently. And so neither side can really say they've categorically won. They haven't really defeated the other. It's an ongoing battle. But until that battle is settled, you're going to be hard-pressed to look at Iraqi democracy as something other than dysfunctional.
Gotcha.
Yeah, another problem as far as like regional perspectives of Iraq. And I think, to put it bluntly, there's not really a nice way to say it. To a degree, Iraqi democracy is kind of seen as an American rape baby. Like it's something that happened because of an American invasion that was broadly seen as being, one, unjustified, and two, overly violent. Lots of people died because of the American invasion of Iraq. So there's a lot of suspicion of the kinds of institutions that are built by an occupying foreign power in the region. Well, that's what happens in any region, but certainly in the Arab world in particular. So that's also been a big factor as far as why Iraqi democracy doesn't really receive as much love as other places. If it did succeed, that would almost seem like an endorsement of American interventionism, which nobody really wants. Nobody wants to encourage that.
Yeah.
So that's another kind of problem that Iraqi democracy faces.
Yeah, we talked before about how norms change at more of a glacial pace than your ability to just like draft up a constitution and hand it to someone and be like, hey, this is how you run governments. They're not just going to immediately say, okay, we'll just copy your build and do exactly as you said. It's like the strongest force would be their habits of how they've done stuff in the past. And they can make incremental change from there, but they're not going to like completely reinvent their entire perception of politics and governance and how everything should be done. That's like too much, too fast, too soon.
Oh, it'll take a while. But yeah, those are the problems faced by Iraqi democracy. That's why they don't really stand out in that regard, even though they're probably more free than most of their neighbors.
Makes sense.
Let's see, I think I did have an update on South Korea, but it's not much. I think we left off last time when we were talking about this. We talked about the martial law declaration. It was rolled back in a matter of hours. Everybody was big mad about it. So I think last time the most recent update had been that there was an impeachment vote, but that it actually failed because the Conservative Party in Korea instructed its members to walk out and not vote for it. So since then, in the past week, the opposition organized another vote. They had actually promised to have a vote on impeaching the president every Saturday until it succeeded. So they were not backing down. So they had another vote. And in the second one, the Conservative Party leadership actually told people to just kind of vote how they wanted. They did not instruct people not to vote for it. And there were enough conservative politicians who ultimately voted for impeachment to make it happen. So the president of South Korea has now been impeached. There's going to be an investigation. I think the Constitutional Court is going to take a look at the impeachment, and they actually have to rule on it in order for it to kind of move forward and progress with the actual removal of the president. We'll see how that goes. That decision is pending, but that's kind of where we are right now on that front. The Conservative Party had been kind of wary about impeaching the president, even though he was like extremely unpopular after the martial law imbroglio. But there was a fear that the opposition leader would end up becoming president if they did vote to remove him, which is kind of a weak reason to do that, but that was their justification. Public pressure grew over time, and eventually, the party kind of folded on that. They said, okay, this isn't going to work. I think the straw that really broke the camel's back, though, is that the president was kind of, I didn't read specifically that this was the case, but, reading about the interactions between the president and the Conservative Party leadership, I got the impression that the president was just failing utterly to coordinate with them. Like, it seemed like even with the martial law thing, you could see that, right? He did not consult the leadership of his own party before he did that. And it seems that he's still failing to do that, because the party leadership basically came out and said that, they had not coordinated with him on any of the stuff he's done since the martial law thing fell apart. Because he's come out and started defending himself. At first, he apologized. The president apologized for the martial law declaration and walked it back. But then a couple days later, he started defending it again. He started saying that, he's going to fight to the end. He hinted that he would resign, and then he walked that back. And then he said, I'm not going to resign. I'm going to stick it out as long as possible. And the leadership of his party didn't really seem to know how to react to any of that. I didn't get the impression that they were in on that sequence of events. So I think after a week of dealing with that bullshit, they finally just threw up their hands and said, fuck it. We're not going to go to bat for this guy anymore. It's just not worth the fucking effort. So everybody can just vote their conscience. And if that results in impeachment, then fine, fuck him. And that's what happened. So it seems like Mr. Yoon is a very, how should I say, passionate person. He seems to not do a lot of thinking before he acts. And he had a reputation for that, like, before he was even elected years ago. So not necessarily surprising that's how his presidency has panned out. And that's how he's acting now. But I'm sure it must be absolutely exasperating for his party. He's not given them just anything to work with.
Yeah, it's hard for them to advocate for him and get any momentum when he's just being a loose cannon and a silly goose.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. So it seems like, while we don't have the Constitutional Court's final decision, he will, I imagine, probably be removed. And he will be the second president to be removed in, I think, just the past 10 years, because the last one was in 2016. You might remember we talked about it way back when we first started doing this in 2017. South Korea's president was impeached in 2016 because of a whole bizarre sequence of events that involved, like, an influencer within the administration who was friends with the president, but who was also, like, a member of a cult. And, the cult was kind of influencing the decision making by way of paying for, not paying for influence, but selling access to the president. If anybody wanted to try to influence public policy, they could pay this friend, and they would kind of get an audience with the president. Very strange stuff. And it all started with, like, this woman, this friend's young lover, a guy who was like 20 years younger than her, and getting mad at her for some petty bullshit, and then going to the press about all of her corruption. It was a pretty hilarious story at the time. Yeah. Also, the president that was impeached last time was a member of the same party that's getting the same party that President Yoon right now is a member of. So they're having a rough time. They've had a rough decade. They've had some problems with what you would call in the United States candidate quality.
We have bad politicians.
Oh, another fun fact about President Yoon. So the president that was impeached before was President Park.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you're impeached, there has to be an investigation, a trial, etc. That'll happen to Yoon too. So President Park had an investigation, and there was, of course, a lead prosecutor on that investigation. Would you care, Neuro, to guess who the lead prosecutor was?
Is it the current president?
Bingo.
Yeah.
Same guy.
What a mess.
That was one of the ways that his name got big. He got known in the news as the lead prosecutor for the impeachment in 2016.
Oh, how the turntables. Now he's in trouble.
Yep. A little bit of irony there. See, not too much has been happening. Well, a lot has been happening in Syria, but I'm mostly looking at the government situation, and I don't think there's been a lot of traction on that yet. There's been talk about the Russians not immediately leaving, but I've also heard and seen evidence that they are leaving. They're just doing it slowly. You know, Russia, as has been famously established by now, does not really have a lot of proficiency with logistics. So withdrawing from two major military bases is kind of a heavy lift, especially if you're doing it on short notice. And, you know, obviously the collapse of the Assad government happened on pretty short notice. So, you know, maybe not ironically, but let's say funnily, you know, the Russians are now in Syria in a very similar position that the United States was in when it withdrew from Afghanistan, which is that the government collapsed faster than expected, and U.S. forces evacuating the country ended up nose to nose with the rebels that they had been bombing, you know, for the previous 20 years. So there's kind of an awkward set of exchanges that are happening right now in which the Russians are saying that they're not withdrawing, but are obviously packing shit up and moving assets out of the country. They also have said that they're trying to engage with the new rebels. I don't want to say new government because that doesn't really exist yet, but they're engaging with the leadership of various rebel groups, trying to presumably negotiate some kind of new arrangement in which they can keep the bases in Syria. I'm pretty dubious that the rebels will be game for that, not least because a lot of foreign backers of the rebels don't really want it. I'm sure Turkey in particular would prefer that Syria in the future is just in their sphere of influence, indisputably, and Russian bases are not going to be conducive to that. So I imagine that they're going to lean on rebel groups in the country not to play ball with Moscow on that count. So, you know, besides that and the fact that the Russians have been bombing the rebels for the past 10 years, I don't see a lot of room for the Russians to use there in order to try to keep the bases. So probably they will just very quietly withdraw from the country and they'll just keep a low profile while they do it. So there's not too much bad press about it. There's certainly been quite a bit of chortling on certain online communities. NCD is always hilarious. So it's not a good look for them in the region. You know, they had made a big deal of it when they intervened in Syria in 2014 about how Russia was a much more reliable ally than the United States, and that when shit hits the fan, Russia is a better partner, because regardless of context or circumstances, if you're allied with Russia, the Russian government will come and help you out, be it a foreign invasion, an uprising, mass protest, whatever. Moscow doesn't care. And doesn't seem to have stopped Assad from losing power. So the credibility of those commitments is in question now.
How much of a military presence do they have there?
They had two major military bases. One is the naval base at Tartus. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'll just apologize in advance. And then they had an air base a little bit north of Tartus at Hanaiman. I can't even begin to pronounce the air base's name. But those were the two main ones. They've had them for a long time. You know, they actually first got them in the early 70s when the Soviets reached out and started cultivating a relationship with the Hafez al-Assad government, which had recently come to power in Syria at the time.
You did it.
That's about all I had on Syria. Oh, they did. Have you ever heard of the Golan Heights?
Golan Heights? No.
Yeah, okay. So the Golan Heights is basically the territory between Syria and Israel. Specifically, it's like a really mountainous region. The topography of Israel is such that the country is very low. It's basically like a coastal strip of territory. And then there's kind of a mountain range to the north that runs through Lebanon and western Syria. And that range kind of runs astride the Israeli-Syrian border. Now, historically, I mean, when I say historically, I mean like 100 years, whatever. The Syrians controlled all of that mountain range. So they held the high ground, and then the Israeli side of the border was the low ground at the foot of those mountains. That kind of put the Israelis at a disadvantage, because that meant that, you know, the Syrians could put artillery as well as just general military forces there and have immediate access to the Israeli lowlands. In contrast, you know, if the Israelis attacked them, they would have to fight through the mountains. So it was a fairly defensible position, which gave the Syrians a big strategic advantage. So what happened is that in the, I want to say, 6-Day War, chat, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe it was the 6-Day War when the Israelis seized the Golan Heights from the Syrians. And at that point, it became occupied territory. Now, the Israelis have since formally annexed the territory. They say it's theirs. The Syrian government still claims it, though, and rejects categorically any Israeli claims to the territory. Who's right, who's wrong? I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. That's subjective. People can hash that out in chat if they want. But that's the status quo. And the UN, as part of peace negotiations, had actually dispatched peacekeepers to patrol a strip of territory astride the border between the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and Syria proper. And that sort of demilitarized zone has been in place for several decades. But since the Assad government fell, the Israeli government has actually moved troops into that buffer zone. They say, basically to protect them, but it's kind of a joke because the Golan Heights themselves were supposed to be the buffer zone. So now they need a buffer zone for the buffer zone. Make of that what you will. It's certainly not doing anything to discount accusations that Israel is an expansionist power. Beyond that, Israel has also been pretty forward in trying to destroy leftover Syrian army equipment. There's been several hundred airstrikes by the Israeli Air Force in Syria, destroying things like ships. The Syrian Navy, what was left of it, basically has been destroyed. They've been going after ballistic missiles. They've been going after research facilities, anything and everything that Israel would not want a future government in Syria to have. They have gone after. Now is the time to strike in their mind because there's basically just no way for any authority in Syria to push back. So that they've been very forward basically since the Assad government fell. They have not blanched at pursuing their interests, as always. Yeah, I think I was reading that after Assad's government fell, no less than the air forces of 3 separate governments had been bombing Syria. So the Israelis have been bombing, as I just described. The United States still has its mission in eastern Syria, allied with the Kurds, in which they periodically, bomb Islamic State targets, since they're still active in the region, specifically in eastern Syria. And then, of course, the Turkish Air Force doesn't shy from just bombing Kurds along the border when it feels like it. So while the Assad government is gone, it's going to be a while before the country is fully sovereign again. There's still an immense amount of foreign influence in the country. So getting a new government on its feet is going to take a lot of time, let alone getting it sovereign.
Yeah, and making sure that it sticks and it's actually an improvement on what happened before, so it doesn't happen like Tunisia where it's like, yay, change, and then they just go right back to what they were doing before.
Well, to be fair to Tunisia, they did have that 10-year period where democracy was kind of sort of working. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until the past few years that it kind of just failed, basically. Syria may not even have that. Most of the leading rebel groups in the country are not liberal in outlook, to put it mildly. So it remains to be seen how that's going to shake out in terms of the formation of a new government. We shall see.
We've got some related questions to that. What if people don't want to be organized like democracy? Are they right or not? And the second question, have you seen what democracy is now in EU, where people voted for one power in France, Netherlands, Moldova, Bulgaria, and EU, but manipulation made other people be in charge?
Well, that's a big question. A lot of those examples differ in terms of their individual context. But we can get into that. That's what the segment is all about. Before I do, let me throw out the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So, if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody, and we do enjoy the feedback we get from chat. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. And I'll read chat while we do this, because I can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, but I will see it. I will get the feedback, and we do enjoy it. So that said, Okay, what was the first part of the question again?
What if people don't want to be organized in democracy?
Are they right or wrong? I mean, that's subjective, right? If people don't want democracy, then they're definitely not going to have it. In order for a democratic government to function, everybody has to be on board. You can't have like a large segment of the population actively trying to sabotage it because they don't want to play by liberal rules. If people don't see the value of liberal governance, and I hope everybody knows what I mean by liberal governance. I'm not, for the Americans listening, that's not left-wing liberalism. I'm using like the dictionary definition of liberalism. Political pluralism, rule of law, free markets, blah, 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 all that jazz, like Enlightenment liberalism, let's say. If even just a large minority of people in a country don't want liberal democracy, then it's not going to work, right? Because the people who don't want it are going to get into positions of power and they're just going to sabotage it and, just abuse the shit out of their offices. And it's just going to be rendered impractical. So, if you have a population where most people don't want democracy, then it's not going to happen. You're going to get something else. What that is going to differ depending on individual case. As far as whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing to want democracy or not, that's purely subjective. Obviously, in the West, we prefer democracy, so we tend to be very, very skeptical of authoritarian political alternatives to democracy. But there are other political traditions in the world where authoritarianism is more tolerated, or if not more tolerated, is seen as kind of part of a trade-off for better governance. There's a number of states in the region that are nominally democratic, but kind of lean towards more of a statist, hierarchical approach to governance. And for a lot of people, that kind of just fits naturally, historically speaking. East Asia in particular has had very strong states. So that's not really anything new there. But it's not necessarily good or bad, per se. The best form of government is the government that the people of a given polity want and will tolerate. And sometimes that may not be democracy. I don't think that's going to end well. Democracies have become prominent for a reason. And it's not just because the United States is a superpower and kind of implicitly, if not explicitly, pushes for countries around the world to be democratic. Having mechanisms of accountability in a political system is an excellent way to try to prevent the worst excesses of the kinds of people that invariably are attracted to power and end up in power in government. Mm-hmm. And systems that are not democratic do not have such mechanisms. So, as has been said historically, the best form of government is enlightened despotism. You want somebody to have all the power, but he uses it for the national interest. He uses it for the good of the country and for the good of his people. And some of the statist models in East Asia kind of come pretty close to that. But all of that stuff, enlightened despotism or East Asian statist models, those only work when you have the right people in charge. Kind of like a monarchy is only really successful if you have a good leader. But invariably, you're going to end up having a bad leader sooner or later. And that's when the shit really hits the fan.
Yeah, that comes to mind for me, historically speaking, is Marcus Aurelius is often lauded as one of the thinking, emperor of Rome, and he was supposed to be a very good and thoughtful man as far as emperors are to be considered. And his son was one of the very worst that Rome ever had. So while it might be cool that maybe, yes, you have a leader who has lots of power and they can do lots of good stuff during their term, what happens after they die? Because you have to choose another person and they could be completely opposite of that, even if they're directly related to them. And another thing, too, is if you grow up in power, it gives you a very different perspective of the world than if you grow up middle class or even like slightly upper class. Like being born the son of an emperor is going to give you a very, very unusual perspective on reality and just what you're entitled to and what you have access to. So, yeah, I think one of the fundamentals that is jumping out at me for maybe not necessarily democracy, but a way to just make sure power doesn't get out of hand is to divide it between more people. And the question is, how do you divide it? Across how many people, and then how do you share power, and then how do you transfer power? And those are all really big questions, and the way that you go about that depends on, like you said, what the people will tolerate and what they think makes sense. I can see some people in chat saying that the U.S. isn't democratic anymore. I think we have.
It's still democratic.
I think we
It's
have an
definitely
indirect democracy.
Indirect democracy. Well, yeah. I mean, you would have to have like full-on Athenian-style democracy if you wanted direct democracy, but with 300 plus million people, that's pretty hard to do. So that's why you kind of have to have federalism, decentralized democratic decision making. But yeah, I mean, it is a democracy. Like, you can't say that people are not getting what they want. Very clearly, many people want Trump, and they have him. Right? They can't blame rigging or the deep state or whatever for not having him. He's going to be in power again, and that is democracy.
Yep.
I think the substantive criticism on that count is more in the oligarchy direction. Some people have accused the U.S. of being an oligarchy where, super powerful billionaires kind of secretly control things behind the scenes, which I disagree with, because I don't think they have strong mechanisms to exert power beyond the usual mechanisms of lobbying. Lobbying is a strong one, but a lot of that is just access to power, whispering in the ears of princes. But the actual money has not been like a good source of influence, because if you look at the way money has been used in politics in the United States, it hasn't really generated a big return on investment. I mean, consider how much more money Kamala Harris's campaign spent than Trump's campaign in the recent presidential election, right? Like, if you're a Harris supporter, the result of the election is a pretty piss poor return on investment. Like, you got beat by a guy who probably spent less than half of you. So what the fuck? Like, why spend so much if you're not going to win? So I don't think the money is as influential as people make it out to be. I'm not going to say it's not influential at all. It's definitely a factor. But it's not the decisive factor. And I think the only other real argument that can be made about oligarchical influence in U.S. politics is information. And that's kind of more of a Noam Chomsky type argument about manufacturing consent, dominating sources of information and manipulating the public into believing this, that, or the other so you can get certain outcomes. I don't agree with, for whatever it's worth to hear some random guy you don't know on a StarCraft 2 stream say this. I don't agree with Noam Chomsky on that. I don't think he's correct. I don't think that control of the media, quote unquote, is meaningful, because you don't monopolize information, right? There's just too much media, especially now in the age of the internet, for anybody to seriously actually control information to the degree that would be necessary to actually manufacture consent. The better descriptor of how American media works is that people self-select into media that tells them that they're right. You don't need to propagandize people who want propaganda. They self-select into it. And because it's a fairly competitive marketplace for propaganda, I would say that the result of American elections is more of an accurate reflection of what people want than a reflection of what oligarchs want. And again, I would concede that the information space is dominated by large players, but there's lots of alternative media out there. And more people are using that alternative media. And a lot of it is pretty shit, but media has always been pretty shit. That's not new. It's not like bad information is some new factor. If you're going to argue that the United States now is not a democracy because information has been co-opted by billionaires, then it's never been a democracy by that definition. Because sources of information in the United States have always been influenced in that way. It's not new. We could get into a whole thing about whether or not Citizens United was even really meaningful, because it's not like money wasn't already in American politics and had not always been. Citizens United just removed some of the guardrails that, mind you, were not really functioning. They did not really protect people and the American body politic from the influence of wealthy elites. Again, if I think that wealthy elites don't exert as much power as people think, it's not because I think that there's an even playing field. I concede that. I just don't think the money has returned enough of an investment, has exhibited enough return on investment to really make that argument viable. There's just been too many mixed outcomes there to argue that anybody with more than $1 billion in money and a willingness to spend it in politics can control outcomes like they can't. Maybe at most you can influence a close election, which we've had, but at that point you're also going to have to compete against every other factor that influences a close election, which can be things as simple as the weather, right? If it's close, then people who don't vote because the weather is bad could be enough to swing it one way or the other. So which of the multitude of factors that influence how people vote is responsible for the outcome of a close election is impossible to determine. You just can't. Like, there's no way mathematically to pick apart all of the different factors and identify the individual one that is the most important. So just scientifically speaking, like empirically speaking, very difficult to argue that specifically it was the oligarchs that decided the outcome. Like, you would be hard pressed to make that convincingly, in my opinion. And again, that's an open debate. I would expect pushback on that. That's not unusual. I certainly said some controversial stuff last time for which we got pushback. I still haven't seen the chat for that, and I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I just published the VOD for it, I think yesterday, so you should be able to check
cool.
it. The VODs are really big. It's like 48 hours each, so you probably have to find a
no
time
problem.
slot on it.
It's not the first subathon I've picked through.
Cheers.
So that was the first part of the question. Second part of the question. So a lot of different states had elections where the outcome ended up getting subverted somehow. And I don't know that I would entirely agree with that in all of the examples listed, because a lot of those are very different in context. Romania, I think, is the best example, because I'm still not entirely sure where the Constitutional Court got off ordering a rerun rather of the election. I know that they said that there had been foreign interference, but like the evidence was pretty mild. And as I've argued before, I don't really think social media influence is nearly as powerful as the broader public seems to think it is. So I don't really buy the idea that Russian influence on like TikTok or something is what ultimately led to that fringe far-right candidate outstripping expectations in the election. I think it probably was just more general discontent with the establishment. Disestablishmentarianism has been like one of the driving forces in Western politics for like 10 some years now. So it shouldn't be all that surprising that Romania would not be any different, even if people don't necessarily think of Romania as being part of the West. I think it still kind of qualifies. So Romania, probably a better example of that. Not so much France, which is going to upset a lot of people. But yeah, there's not really like an ironclad rule that requires Macron to appoint as prime minister somebody from the left-wing coalition. Right, they won the most votes, but he's within his rights to appoint, whatever like random center-right nobody that he wants. He actually did appoint a new prime minister this past week. Bernier had been ousted in the vote of no confidence, and this past week he announced that he was going to appoint Bayrou, whom I believe is the leader, I think, of one of the main center-right parties, which isn't saying much. They're pretty small, but yeah, it seems like Macron is following through with my prediction, which is that he would just keep appointing like basic bitch center-right political politicians in the position until new elections can be held in, what was it, June or July, whatever, of 2025. So the criticism from the left in France is that, he should, given that the left-wing coalition won the most votes, appoint somebody from their coalition to the prime minister's office. But of course, the counter-argument from Macron is going to be that they didn't win a majority. They need a coalition partner in order to form a majority government, and he's not willing to do that. They're obviously not going to form a coalition government with fucking Marine Le Pen, and the National Rally. Sorry, the National Rally. So that means they have to work with Macron to get a majority, and if Macron doesn't want to play ball, then it's just not going to happen. And he's very clearly exhibited that he's not willing to do that. And since he's president, even if it is very domineering in style, legally speaking, it's viable. So I think until somebody in French politics can get a clear majority or win the presidential election and get Macron out of power, there's probably not going to be any change in the deadlock that's defined French politics. But a deadlock is not the same thing as like subverting an election. Again, the French left didn't win a majority. Macron is a Jupiterian is the adjective I've seen used to describe him on many occasions. Given his personality, it shouldn't be a surprise that he's doing that. But again, he's not doing anything illegal. This is how the system is designed, right? The republic's political institutions were designed to be more executive, to have more power vested in the executive branch. If you want to blame somebody, blame Charles de Gaulle. So France, I don't feel, is a good example of that, what they're talking about. And what were some of the other examples listed?
Let me see if I can scroll up. Chat has been popping off tonight. Thanks for being here, everybody. By the way, if you ask a question and it isn't answered right away, or you're not intentionally being ignored, sometimes the chat rolls too fast, or I'm letting Agent Smith finish his current train of thought, just so I'm not just interrupting him every 2 seconds with the next question before he can finish the previous one. It was France, Netherlands, Moldova, Bulgaria.
Netherlands, Bulgaria. Okay. I'm not sure about Bulgaria. Moldova. I'm not sure why Moldova is included. Because I think they did just have a genuinely close election that was not like overturned or otherwise criticized. Yeah, the Netherlands also is not a good example because I think Geert Wilders did end up in the new government, right? A lot of people didn't want him in government. They kind of wanted to have a French-style cordon sanitaire around him and his far-right party. But I think the new right-wing government did involve him in the coalition. I think the price of that was that he could not be prime minister, despite the fact that his party had overperformed, in the elections. But he did end up in the coalition. And he didn't have a big enough majority to like form his own government. He needed coalition partners. So those partners are within their rights to exact high demands if they wish for their cooperation. That's all just, in the case of France and the Netherlands and also Moldova, that's pretty much just democracy working the way it's supposed to work. Romania, I would agree. Bulgaria, I'm not familiar with. I'm not sure what that's about. I'd have to go and do more research. Yeah, those would be the main ones that come to mind. Maybe you could throw in the UK. I know a lot of people there were pretty upset that Brexit was not implemented correctly, is the argument I've heard. They should have taken advantage of Brexit and they failed to do it, and that's a betrayal of the Brexit referendum. There's more of an argument there that the public will was sort of deflected, if you like. But the deflecting was done by the same party that was, implementing Brexit, right? They were the pro-Brexit guys. Boris Johnson, in particular, was an explicitly pro-Brexit politician and ended up prime minister. So I don't think that's like institutional resistance in that case. I think political leadership in the UK has just been very, very subpar for the past 10 years, maybe even longer than that. I don't think that would be a controversial statement. I would welcome feedback from British people on that. But I suspect a lot of them would agree that the leadership cast in the UK has been underperforming for an extended period of time.
Sounds like what you were saying about South Korea.
Yeah, well, South Korea is a little different. Like, South Korea's leadership has been okay when they've been in power. They've just had to deal with a lot of partisanship. And that's kind of hobbled the ability of the legislature in particular, to kind of do anything. But otherwise, they can still pass bills and stuff, and the leadership is able to kind of produce a coherent program that they want to implement. I never really got that impression from like the May government or the Johnson government or that random lady who was prime minister for like a week. What was that? Liz Truss. That's what it was. The lady who didn't outlast the lettuce. Like, I just haven't gotten the impression that there's been a solid plan for, as far as like that can set a direction for the country. You can see that even in countries that have been struggling. Like, they'll have a plan. It may be like a superficial plan that they have no intention of actually implementing because they just want to rob the country blind. But they'll have a plan. They'll have like a 4-year plan. And in the UK, like, they produce plans, they produce papers, and then they just don't really follow through. I think there's been like, what was it? There was like a big infrastructure project to build a high-speed rail line up through like the northern part of the UK. I think northern England specifically. And the idea was that it would be a project that would generate jobs and business for parts of England that have not traditionally, attracted a lot of investment and that were not very economically dynamic. The northern part of England, and as well as just the UK generally, have not been as economically dynamic historically and have suffered from a lack of attention from the British government, which tends to focus disproportionately on industries that are more focused in the southern part of the UK. So the idea was, let's have a big infrastructure project. We'll build a high-speed rail to try to connect the northern part of the country to the rest of it. And, that project has been in the planning stage for like 10 years, 15 years. Like, it seems like they're just perpetually thinking about it, but not doing it. So that's the kind of problem that they're really struggling with right now. They need more resources to do stuff. They don't have enough because of the fiscal situation. And then even when they have enough to do something, they just sort of get caught in this endless decision-making cycle that paralyzes them. I think it's been called analysis paralysis. Mm-hmm. Something that afflicts people as well, I might add. Myself especially. I've suffered grievously from paralysis analysis many, many times in my life. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Shit do be pretty complicated sometimes, though.
Yeah. Let's see. We did have some questions from last week. I infer that we have some from this week, so we'll get to those too later if possible. But to get to the ones from last week, so Fuzzy Cord had a question. Heard an interview from a former U.S. ambassador. Says the U.S. is sleepwalking into a war against Russia, possibly China, similar to Britain in the 30s. He says Russia sees the U.S. not as a rival, but as an enemy. U.S. politicians, on the other hand, seem unwilling to classify Russia as an enemy and unable to provide a clear picture to the public. The U.S.'s recent actions, failing to respond to Crimea in 2014, pulling out of Afghanistan, has therefore sent signals which encourage other powers towards aggression. Is there really a Pearl Harbor moment looming in the future, as he claims? I think this is kind of a what was his name? Fuck, I forgot his name. Anyway, this is a situation where I would agree with the analysis, but not the conclusion. Like, I think he's right that there's been a lot of fucking around in American foreign policy vis-a-vis Eastern Europe for 25 some years now, basically since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like, the foreign policy that the United States has had towards the region has just largely been apathetic. Like, there's just been general disinterest. Not nearly enough attention has been paid to it. And I think on that count, signals have been very mixed. The signals that Washington has sent in Eastern Europe, and to Russia in particular, have not been nearly coherent or decisive enough over time to deter aggression or to pacify Russian concerns about American intentions. I would point out that I don't think Russia is really concerned about like an invasion. The Russian government sometimes talks about, the threat from the West and, they're trying to take over, take the resources, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's the real concern in Moscow. I think the concern is really a lot more about potentially the West supporting some kind of dissident movement that could result in a change in government, which is a big problem if you are an authoritarian government, because that means you, that's going to affect you personally. So they tend to take that kind of threat very personally. So what Russia really wants the West to do is not to promise not to invade. They don't think they're going to do that. What they've really wanted the West to do is to stop supporting, NGOs, political parties, movements, etc., that fight for more and better governance in the country. Anti-corruption, pro-democracy, that kind of stuff is what really bothers authoritarian governments. They would like that to stop, which probably is not going to happen, because I think if you're a politician in Washington, you would be hard-pressed to actually concede on those demands and then escape significant public vitriol. You would be characterized as caving into the demands of butchers and autocrats. And people would probably turn on you pretty readily. There is kind of a growing sense in the country that, more should be done to try to tolerate the existence of these regimes. But I think a lot of people would agree that That doesn't have to include not supporting people who are fighting for their rights, or at least not even fighting for them, advocating them, just that. So I think you're kind of going to get into a sovereignty debate at that point. Is the United States within its sovereign right to allow groups that advocate for liberalism abroad to operate in its territory, and to also send money to like-minded groups in foreign countries? I think Washington would say that is a sovereignty issue and that it's within their right to do that. But of course, the response from autocrats is going to be that that's an existential threat for us, so we're going to apply pressure on you in whatever way we can until you agree to stop doing that. So, again, that's kind of a subjective question. As far as whether or not that's who's right in that situation, people can hash that out. Obviously, people are going to be different minds about that, but that's kind of the difficult situation that we find ourselves in Eastern Europe, because Russia wants the West to do stuff that the West, and Washington in particular, is not very interested in doing. And the West, in turn, wants Russia to just kind of accept the status quo, which obviously Moscow does not find especially acceptable. So, that doesn't really even get into the whole Russian pathology about Ukraine, which is another big factor for the war there. But as far as relations between Russia and the West in particular, not necessarily as relating to Ukraine, the circumstances I've described are the principal underlying issue. One of the best articles I read about tensions between West and Russia was an article from like 10, 15 years ago in a publication that doesn't actually exist anymore. I think it was like American Interest, something like that. It was a foreign policy magazine. And they had a writer come on and do a whole piece about, how Russia really struggles to exert influence in its near abroad, which it considers its sphere of influence, and why Russia perceives that failure as being partly because the West refuses to help them exert influence in the region, right? They see the region turning away from them because of their inability to attract them organically, as being a threat to that national interest, and they want the West to explicitly reject treaties by countries in the region to integrate with the West in order to pacify Russian concerns about their security. And of course, the West doesn't want to do that because the West backs a kind of international order where states are sovereign and independent. And the West has been more of the mind that the way to pacify Russia has been to try to create some kind of set of international institutions that can guarantee everybody's security in Europe, not just Russia's or America's, not just the big players. And Moscow has historically been very resistant to that because they see that as putting Russia on an equal footing with, as Vladimir Putin put it, countries that don't matter. That's literally a quote from him. He thinks Russia deserves special consideration, and they do not find an arrangement where they're just one country among many and some kind of international arrangement guaranteeing everybody's security in Europe as being sufficient. So, we could go around and around and arguing about American foreign policy and Russian foreign policy and, who has the moral high ground or whatever. But regardless, like this guy's analysis here, this ambassador, John J. Sullivan, he's got a lot of good points about like the dysfunction of American foreign policy in the region and why that's de facto encouraged Russian aggression, and also been unable to otherwise diffuse that aggression, to diffuse the tension in the relationship. But the idea that it's kind of creating an incentive for other powers to jump in, such that there could be said to be a Pearl Harbor moment, looming in the future, I don't agree with that. Because really the only possibility there is Taiwan. Like there's Iran is hurting right now. They're not really interested in doing too much. They're very much on the back foot at the moment, and probably will be, even if they wanted to do a Pearl Harbor thing. I don't even know how they would do it. Like, what are they going to do? Are they going to attack the American naval base in Qatar? They could do some damage, but like, then what? Like, they can't invade Qatar. They don't have the ability to project force outside of Iran far enough to do that. They can lob some rockets at Israel, but like, they can't invade Israel. They don't have the power to do that. So, they could definitely attack the United States, but then the result is just bad things happen to them. The United States has what's called escalatory dominance in the relationship with Iran. So even if Iran can kind of nip at the heels of, the Western establishment in the Middle East, the sort of the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel axis of countries, they don't really have the ability to threaten it beyond that. It can't go beyond just threats and the occasional like rocket lobbed in the general direction of Saudi Arabia. And ultimately, what will happen then is that there will be a tit-for-tat escalation that the United States can dominate, right? Eventually, the United States will do something that they cannot retaliate to proportionately. So that is that's the big factor there. That's why I say Iran is not in a position to do anything right now. Something that would have to change in their underlying economy to give them the resources to build stronger institutions that would allow them to build up capacity, and they're nowhere near that right now. So it's not going to be the Middle East, it's not going to be Iran, and Russia is already like knee deep in the Ukraine war. So yeah, I don't really see what they're going to do. China and Taiwan is the only thing that qualifies. So hypothetically, the United States failing to deter Russia from invading Ukraine by way of its incoherent foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, that could be said to encourage China to invade Taiwan. I can understand that reasoning, but at the same time, if you read analysis about Chinese foreign policy from China-focused experts, China-focused analysts, they're a little bit skeptical about the prospect that China will actually invade Taiwan like in the next 10 years or something. You know, there is some argumentation that Xi Jinping may want to do it for himself. That may be something that he wants to do, maybe for like legacy reasons. But beyond that, like in terms of core Chinese interest, it doesn't really make sense right now because they're exerting a lot of influence over Taiwan. Chinese economic influence over Taiwan is pretty immense, and it's only growing with time. So that gives them a lot of tools to work with in Taiwan. That's to say nothing of all the espionage. You know, if you think China does a lot of espionage targeting the United States, it's nothing compared to the espionage they do in Taiwan. You know, they've infiltrated many layers of the government. There's an immense amount of propaganda in the country that is paid for by the Chinese government. Like, it's a whole other ballgame in Taiwan. Much more intense. So, you know, between that and the economic influence, they're probably going to be able to get most of what they want out of Taiwan without having to invade. You know, they don't need a messy military confrontation with the global superpower of the day to achieve their objectives in the Taiwan Strait. And if that's the case, then why start a war? As I've said before on here, China would be doing the United States a favor by starting a war. Like, even if they win, a military confrontation is the type of confrontation that the United States is going to be the strongest at. Because militarily, we're much more on an equitable footing with China in the region than we are in terms of economic influence. Chinese economic influence in East Asia, as well as Southeast Asia, has been growing significantly over the past 10, 20 years. And Washington has just been paralyzed in terms of economic public policy in the region, like economic diplomacy in the region, rather. Like the leaders in the region, rather, keep asking Washington for some kind of free trade deal or arrangement in which American economic influence can increase in the region to try to offset Chinese economic influence. And Washington has not been able to do that. So there's very little optimism in the region that that's going to happen at this point. So at most, the United States can be said to be maintaining a toehold of influence in East Asia and Southeast Asia by way of its military presence. And increasingly, that's how a lot of countries are treating their relationship with the United States and China. China is the country they go to when they want to do business, want to improve their economic performance, you know, when they want to make progress, basically. But then they'll go to the United States for security issues in the region, either related to China or not related to China. And so that's the balance. Whether or not that works in the long term, anybody's guess. But that's basically what the dynamic is right now. And so, you know, that being the case, like, Washington just doesn't have anything to offer. Like, they basically just kind of voted themselves out of like a whole chunk of the Sino-American competition, the economic side of it. So, yeah, I mean, again, the military confrontation would be preferable to the economic confrontation that China has been doing, which the United States is at a disadvantage in. And, you know, that being the case, the game theory would be that China will just keep doing what's working. So that's why I don't think they'll invade Taiwan. Like, invading Taiwan just plays to too many American strengths, whereas not invading Taiwan and just exerting economic and political influence plays to Chinese strengths. So just logically speaking, strategically speaking, that's the move. You know, an outright invasion, I think, would only happen if there was some kind of economic crisis. much bigger than whatever's happening now, right? The economy in China has been struggling, but it's not really in crisis, I would argue. So until there's a crisis, and even if there was an economic crisis, I think it would have to be a crisis that resulted in enough public discontent that the party felt threatened, such that they might want to make some kind of nationalist play for Taiwan. Basically, it's the Falklands War all over again. The Argentine government was facing immense economic problems because of, there's a whole history there. I'll resist the urge to explain the entire history of Latin American economic performance in the 70s and 80s, but Argentina's economy was struggling just before the war started, and one of the ways the military junta governing Argentina decided to handle that, because they couldn't improve the economy, they just didn't have the tools to do it, they decided to just invade the Falkland Islands, and their hope was that that would kind of rally people around the flag and around the government, such that the government's popularity would be restored. It kind of worked at first, but then of course they lost the war, and that's much worse than, that put them in a worse position than they were in to start with. So it didn't work. Argentina subsequently democratized, unsurprisingly. So I think something of similar scale would have to happen to China, where the government just really felt threatened domestically before they would seriously consider it. That doesn't mean they're not going to prepare for it anyway, right? The Chinese military does technically have a mandate to try to prepare to invade Taiwan. So, there's never going to be into like articles and news reports about Chinese forces preparing to invade Taiwan, having war games in which they're very clearly practicing an invasion, that kind of stuff. That's going to happen whether they're going to try to invade or not. That's just like a core interest for the Chinese government that they're going to continue to task the military to prepare for, regardless of decision making. But in terms of like the actual leadership cast in the Communist Party of China, they're way more focused on domestic issues right now in China. And given how structural and ingrained those problems are, I don't think a big foreign adventure is what they're looking for. They've got enough risk to deal with just in domestic politics without getting into a big messy war that may or may not end in victory for them. So that's a long, rambling, semi-coherent explanation of why I don't think this guy is right about there being a Pearl Harbor moment looming.
You think that the influence victory is way more playing to their geographical location and general strengths rather than trying to play the, quote, opponent's game.
Yeah, that's a good summary. Yeah. I think the only other way you could kind of spin this is by saying that, maybe Russia will launch a first strike against the West in anticipation of either the West joining the war in Ukraine or in anticipation of potentially losing the war in Ukraine. That's possible. Certainly the Russian government has sent lots of signals that it cares deeply about Ukraine and that it cares more about it than the West does, and that if the West does not back off, then it's going to do something crazy. My criticism there would be that a lot of that is just cheap talk. We've talked before about how Russia's strategy as far as communicating to the Western public about its intentions in Ukraine and about the possibility of nuclear war if the West doesn't back off. A lot of that is just North Korean style cheap talk. They're trying to scare the West into backing off, but I don't think they're actually interested in starting a nuclear war with the West. That ends just as badly for them as it does for anybody else. And as far as the West directly getting involved, I don't think that's credible. One of the criticisms I've made, I think I've made it before on here, but if I haven't, this will be the first time. One of the criticisms I had of Trump, just recently when he was talking, well, not him specifically, but one of his advisors that has been tasked with negotiating peace between Russia and Ukraine came out and published on, I think, Twitter or something, a general outline of what he wanted to do. And that's probably not all of what he wants to do, but just going by that, one of his threats that he wants to use to try to get Russia to the negotiating table is the threat that if they don't, then the United States will significantly increase aid to Ukraine. But the trouble with that is that it's not credible because inventories in the US are largely depleted. Like most of what we have to send, we've already sent. We have more we could send, but that would cut into inventories that are being held in reserve in preparation for a potential conflict in other parts of the world. There's only so much you can give away before you start threatening the integrity of your core military force. So I'm not really sure what's meant when they say they want to threaten Russia with that. That doesn't seem credible given everything I've heard about the state of aid to Ukraine. They can give more money, hypothetically, but that's not necessarily going to make a difference on the battlefield, right? That's not going to solve the manpower problem in Ukraine. That's not going to really allow them to buy any more equipment that they're already getting, via aid. Maybe there's some other stuff that they could use the money for that might make a difference, but I'm kind of hard pressed to think of it off the top of my head. So I don't think that's a credible threat. And by extension, I don't think the Russian concern, quote unquote, that the West might get involved, such that the threat of nuclear war would be necessary, is itself credible. It doesn't add up to me. The possibility that they might lose, therefore justifying potential use of nuclear weapons, that doesn't add up to me either, because they're not losing, right? Like, at most you could say that there's slow Russian progress, but in general, even our Ukrainian guest speaker, said that he thought Russia was winning, at least as things stand in the past few months. So I don't find that a credible threat either. So, where's the credible threat that would justify nuclear weapons then? It doesn't seem to exist to me. It doesn't add up. I noticed, another example, the Russian government threatened that if the West ever allowed Ukrainians to use Western ranged fires, cruise missiles and stuff, on targets within Russia, then they would escalate. The implication being that they might strike targets in the West and maybe even use nuclear weapons. That didn't happen. And we even had, I assume what was a Russian guy saying that, if there were any further strikes by American cruise missiles or just Western cruise missiles in Russia, then there would be big escalation and there was a lot of danger. And since then, there has in fact been more Western cruise missile strikes in Russia, and nothing happened, at least nothing of substance. There certainly wasn't any kind of targeting of targets in the West proper, in which aid to Ukraine is being accumulated and then transferred over the border. So, I just don't buy all of this. It strikes me as cheap talk, and I have not taken it seriously. And I'm kind of at pains to explain to people that that's what it is, that there's not like a nuclear Pearl Harbor in the making just because Moscow whines and whinges about the West and supposedly being in a conflict with the West. I don't agree with it, and I don't think the argumentation in that vein is convincing. So again, agree with this guy's analysis, but I don't think the conclusions are correct, for the reasons outlined. And again, as I've said before, I'm fallible. I welcome feedback. I'm sure we're getting some, and I look forward to reading it. But I definitely welcome criticism on this debate, because of course this is very contentious, and there are a lot of different schools of thought and perspectives on it. So hopefully that answers the question to fuzzy chord satisfaction. If not, I'm always happy to return to it. I sometimes miss the gist of questions. That's certainly not unusual for me.
As a reminder, if you disagree with us on anything, feel free to leave us some comments in the chat or some YouTube comments. And just really backing those up with follow-up comments helps us as well understand what's going on and gives us engagement. So appreciate you all.
Thank you all very much. Let's see. Oh, Sea of Whiskey had a question. Recently, it seems to be popular to make YouTube videos claiming a large bulk of the Geneva Convention was written to address atrocities committed by Canadians during World War I. Is this directly relatable, or is Canada just a country that happened to commit atrocities that other countries did as well, and not really the singular reason for many of the items in the text? So I've never seen any of the YouTube videos in question, so I am perhaps not in a position to debate them. I imagine, depending on the quality of the YouTube channel in question, that they've done more research on it than I have. So the real answer here is I don't know. But to add some color commentary to the I don't know, I guess, my impression had been that the Geneva Conventions was an effort after World War I to try to legalize and ban war. Obviously, the Geneva Conventions were not about banning war, but the general trend after World War I was to try to create international institutions that would create a global legal framework through which countries could address and reconcile their differences in a way that did not involve, massive armies being lobbed against each other and getting just thousands of people killed. So, that had kind of been the drive to try to kind of rationalize international relations And my impression had been that the Geneva Conventions were a part of that. Again, the League of Nations was like the main part of legalizing, international conflict. But I had thought that the Geneva Conventions were basically part and parcel of the same movement, the same intellectual sphere. But I could be wrong on that. Certainly, I would welcome feedback on that. Let's see. And then another sea of whiskey. Given one, the most realistic objective, the physics question. The most realistic objective of the LHC has been accomplished and the Higgs boson detection confirmed. And 2, no new major discoveries have been made, only hints of possible new physics. What is the current outlook of further international cooperation on building an even larger collider, as was being discussed in the past, to move beyond LHC energy levels? And what are the political barriers you can foresee in such a huge financial and geographic investment? I can't really answer the first part of the question because I don't know shit about physics. Was not a math guy in school. I was more of a history English guy. Probably not surprising. So yeah, I'm not sure like what the state of the project is as far as new energy colliders. But the second part of the question, what are the political barriers you can foresee in such a huge financial and geographic investment? Yeah, well, for one, just the fact that it's expensive is a big barrier in and of itself. You've got to convince people in power that such expense is justified. And given how, I don't want to say marginal, but, I don't think people in positions of power like presidents and prime ministers and dictators really place physics and physics research high on their list of priorities. I'm pretty sure they've got other stuff they're more interested in. So, that kind of puts a lot of physics researchers at pains to try to gather money for these kinds of projects. Unless they can find some particular utility that they could perhaps drive towards, maybe some discovery that would unlock some new technology that has very practical applications. But I've never gotten the impression that sort of the bleeding edge of physics research has been about that. It could hypothetically indirectly lead to stuff like that, but like the immediate discoveries made by, say, the Higgs boson, I don't think those have been especially revolutionary in terms of practical applications. So that's like one of the big barriers just right off the bat. And that's a traditional barrier anybody in academia has experienced. You've always got to really fight hard to get funding for whatever like pet project that you want money for. That's meant to project your career and your research. Beyond that, international cooperation in particular is a big barrier, because beyond just getting people on board in the first place, then you have the problem of deciding how the benefits are divided. Obviously there's going to be a debate about what happens if you do discover some practical application, like who gets the rights to the subsequent technology, that kind of thing. Beyond that, one of the big barriers I've seen exhibited in the, the fusion reactor research, because that's been a big international project. One of the barriers I've seen exhibited there is that different countries have very particular interests about where the research actually happens. So for example, with the there was a big project that was agreed to between the governments of France and Japan, and I think some other governments as well, to invest in a common project to develop a fusion reactor. And the project ended up getting delayed by like 10, 15 years, whatever it was, because France and Japan both demanded that the fusion reactor be built on their territory. They were very, very insistent on that point, because the project was so big and so much money was being spent on it that whoever had that project built in their territory was going to benefit economically. It was going to generate a lot of jobs, in terms of construction, in terms of research staff, in terms of all of the, support services economy stuff that happens to support all of those workers. It was going to be a big boon. And both France and Japan were particularly interested in some economic stimulus in their economies, which have kind of been stagnating for a prolonged period of time to varying degrees. So that standoff was a huge barrier, and that was like the main thing that delayed it for more than a decade. So yeah, those are the biggest barriers I can think of off the top of my head, and those are definitely going to afflict like whatever LHC. I have trouble saying that for some reason. Those are going to be the big barriers that are going to be faced by whatever LHC cooperative international project that is conjured in the future.
Large Hadron Colliders. And you.
Let's see. Question about Iran. How stable is Iran now? There were big protests a year or two ago. Russia was kicked out of Syria. Israel is biting them in the side, etc. How stable is it? I'll preface this answer by pointing out that it's really hard to determine just how stable an authoritarian government is because they're opaque. They're never like fully honest about just how good or bad their economy is, how stable their governing political coalition is. Like all of that stuff is kind of a black box. You really saw that on full display with the al-Assad government collapse. Because, before the government collapsed, everybody was saying, as we discussed last time, that the civil war was basically over, the Assad government has won, and that everybody should really focus on normalizing relations with Damascus. And then the government just died. So, that's the kind of thing that you kind of have to keep in the back of your head whenever you're listening to analysis about any opaque political system. You never really fully know what's happening. So that said, near as we can tell, Iran is relatively stable. Perhaps surprisingly so, given all of the economic pressure that has been heaped on it by the West collectively. The economy is a mess. It's not good. There's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of inflation. The government has to do all kinds of cutesy little tricks to try to stabilize its currency because nobody wants to use the official exchange rate for obvious reasons. Oil exports are okay, but they've been better. It's not really sufficient to maintain public services or the military or all the other shit the government kind of needs to do. Well, in terms of public services, needs to do. In terms of military adventurism, wants to do. So something's got to give on that count eventually. But otherwise, despite the fact that there are so many people in poverty, the government has actually been very resilient at deflecting pressure in that vein. They can fairly credibly blame foreigners and sanctions for a lot of that. And, while there is actually also at fault a significant amount of corruption in the political system by this, that, and the other powerful politician, the government is able to deflect criticism on that count as well. So overall, they do okay. There are occasional bouts of protests and whatnot, but those are generally crushed in fairly short order. In the case of the hijab protests, they were kind of in an awkward position because, they say that their approach to female affairs, so to speak, is the optimal approach. They think it's women in the West who are oppressed because they're overly sexualized. But of course, that being the case, being that they do have a traditional perspective of women, it doesn't really make sense for them to face protests from women violently, because they do see them as kind of needing protection from men. So that put them in an awkward space, but over time, they just kind of absorbed it, right? They took the criticism, they gave some concessions by easing restrictions and easing enforcement, but then the trade-off, the quid pro quo, if you will, between the moderates and the radicals in Iranian politics is that while they eased enforcement in the short term, they also introduced a lot of new forms of enforcement to try to continue to put pressure on women to adhere to the values that they believe are the government's responsibility to enforce. So, for example, there was a long period of time when you could pretty much just go out in public without a hijab on. Subsequently, there have been a lot of new surveillance measures put in place, that allow the government, that have granted the government greater capacity to track people electronically, digitally, who do not wear a hijab in public, and then to basically punish them after the fact. So, there may be a surveillance camera or whatever that uses facial recognition technology to identify you as a woman not wearing hijab in public, and then you'll get a visit from the police or get arrested or get fined or whatever. Actually, that's another thing they changed. They don't really do arrests so much anymore. Now, the punishment is more indirect. So, for example, they have, interestingly, a two-tier internet in Iran. You can actually get online normally, but what happens is that they throttle that. So the speed, the speed that you can get on the regular internet is very low. If you want good internet access, you have to use the official government outlet, basically the official government ISP. And the government will just deny you access to that if you piss them off. So you're not completely off of the internet in that case, but the internet you do have access to is much inferior at that point. It's much harder to use. So that's the kind of indirect pressure that they have kind of come around to using. They'll also deny you government benefits. They'll put pressure on you in your workplace, try to get you fired. it's more stuff like that now than the direct, put you in prison and then torture you. Yeah, they've kind of moved away from that and are using a more circumspect and, well, quite frankly, a smarter approach. It's more of a deft hand than an iron fist. And that kind of approach, while still disagreeable for people in the West, is actually more effective and has been effective at largely diffusing the pressure that had been applied by the protests.
If you get in trouble, can you opt to have prison and torture but still fast internet instead of the slow internet?
I'm not sure
that's
about
inhumane.
that. I'm not sure how much access political prisoners have in Iran to the internet. Oh. I suspect very little, unfortunately. But yeah, I think the Iranian government has proven to be very resilient at deflecting pressure from the poor economic conditions in the country. And when there has been pressure in the form of mass protests, they have grown increasingly adept at dealing with them. Either, well, really with a combination of violence and with a deft hand, indirect pressure. They kind of flit between violence and the deft hand, depending on the protest in question and the circumstances in which it happens. But they've gotten pretty good at it. So one of the reasons I think that the Iranian government can be described as stable also here, and this is one of my go-tos, is that regardless of how much pressure there is on the government to change things, the government still has a pretty strong base of support in the country. Like, while there are a lot of people, even in conservative areas, that criticize the government, that criticism is more about the corruption. And, that's always going to be there. But otherwise, the proportion of people in Iran who want like a fully liberal Iran with fully representative institutions and that want to throw the Ayatollah out of power entirely and to have no role for Islam in the country's politics, that's pretty small. There's not really as much demand for that as people in the West make it out to be. Really, if there's going to be a revolution in Iran, it's going to be about corruption in the government. Pretty unlikely, given what I've read about Iran, that there's going to be, in that case, a revolution to fully democratize and liberalize the country. There's too many people who have too much of a conservative mindset and just don't want that. So the case in point there is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is chock full of like ideologues, true believers who really believe in the government's mission as protector of conservative values in Iran. So that fact means that if there were broad-based protests that came or seemed to be coming near overthrowing the government, there would probably be a pretty significant backlash from the more conservative elements in society that, while they have their issues with the Ayatollah, will probably side with him in a pinch because they don't particularly trust the left in the country. And I will point out too that while Iran is an authoritarian country, right, their political institutions are not fully representative, they actually do a better job of maintaining the facade of representative governance than a lot of authoritarian countries. Iran, for example, is not an authoritarian one-party state. They actually do allow nominal political competition, right? There are elections that are somewhat competitive. Different people of different backgrounds can run. People who have different notions of how government should do things, they can, throw out those ideas and compete on them. The issue is not that there's no democracy in Iran. The issue is that it's significantly circumscribed. There's a lot of things that you can't talk about, and there's a big fat red line in Iranian politics a number of big fat red lines that you just can't cross. Right? You can't talk about the Ayatollah. You can't talk about like changing the government fully. There are just certain things you can't get into. But they do nominally have elections and somewhat democratic institutions. And that allows the government to get away with more, so to speak. They can argue they have more of a democratic mandate than they could if they were, say, a North Korea-style one-party state. So that gives them a lot more room to maneuver, and I would argue that's one of the reasons that they've been as resilient as they have been. So I don't think Iran is super stable, but I think, for the reasons I've described, that it's stable enough to be credited, with decent ability and governance in terms of deflecting pressure, and that we can probably forecast that they're going to be around a while. That doesn't mean there couldn't be a change in government policy. You kind of seen with the new government that they've been a little less hawkish, mostly because they've kind of gotten their nose bloodied, in Gaza and Lebanon. But And also because the president right now is more of a dovish candidate, relatively speaking. So there can be changes in the direction and nature of public policy in Iran, even without a revolution. So it could be that that's what happens. It's probably unlikely, given the Ayatollah's hold on power, but it's hypothetically possible. And if there were so much pressure from the public on the government that it seemed like it was about to be overthrown, that is a card they could play. They could just give concessions. I don't think the Iranian political system is so inflexible that that's outside the realm of possibility, even if the establishment would really hate it. I think the Iranian establishment is in a much better position to credibly promise and deliver concessions to dissidents than, say, North Korea or Russia at this point. Let's see, what's the deal with those weird-ass drones seen in the sky around New Jersey recently? The government's response has been to say that they seem to just be normal commercial drones, near as they can tell. They also pointed out that one of the videos that allegedly shows a drone flying in New Jersey was actually a plane. So it's probably much ado about nothing. That was my first impulse when I first heard about it. It's probably just random dudes doing dumb shit of some kind. Or maybe even just a commercial operation, or maybe even government drones. Who's to say? It's not as though the left hand always knows what the right hand is doing in government, certainly in the United States. So I don't really think too much about it.
There was a drone swarm here in LA, pretty close to where we live here. Maybe it was within view from our building. But it was really beautiful to see it all come together. It was a promo for some movie or celebrity or something, kind of an experimental thing, probably ridiculously expensive, and that's why they don't do it for every movie and stuff. But the drones all kind of got into a formation and turned a different color to kind of promote something and be in a formation. So I don't know if this is another example of that, where you're coordinating a drone swarm to behave in a certain way. Mm-hmm. But if it's not like super above water what they're doing, that's a rather amusing way to fuck with people. So it's either aliens or government spies or, as you said, random dudes fucking around.
Well, the media hyperventilating has been that it might be foreign drones, that it might be foreign surveillance or spying happening. So it could be that there are spies in New Jersey who are using drones to try to gather information.
But why New Jersey?
Excellent question. I'm sure as mass neotech would agree, that is always a pertinent and relevant question. There is a military facility there, and I think that's kind of what sparked a lot of the media hysteria about it. So that kind of is what got people questioning whether or not it's foreign in nature. Keep in mind, if you want to do espionage in the United States, you really don't need something as like glaringly obvious as drones or even say a huge-ass balloon. A lot of espionage is done by USB drive. You can just stick the USB drive in the computer and then cut and paste the stuff you want to steal, and then you're done. And a lot of the time, you don't even have to do that. A lot of the time, you can just sit at home in southern China or wherever that facility is. They actually have in China a building where they do their hacking. Like, Washington already knows about it. So, you can just hang out there and then just, guess somebody's password, 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever the fuck. And then you just copy paste to the secrets. Like, that's most espionage now. It's not fucking hard. You don't need drones to do any of that shit. It's quite easy. So, that's really the main reason I was skeptical about all the hysteria. Like, if there's going to be espionage, like, why would you even need to do it like this?
This is an old Kukio lore. One of his favorite lines from a techno song was a very thick Russian accent person. This is in the background of some boo, 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 boo. We need to break into their computer server and we take the information out. Which normally, if you're actually trying to do espionage and be subtle about it, there's no reason to cut and paste when you can copy paste and you're less likely to get caught. If you remove it, that makes it more obvious that something has changed, so they can look at the logs of who is there. But yeah, in a lot of spy movies and stuff, they have very unrealistic depictions of what hacking truly is and where you have to go to hack certain things. Like you said, a lot of times the hacking that a person might be doing somersaults and cartwheels over lasers in a smoky room, they could just, from their own laptop at home, find a different way to get access in. Because I think a lot of people here have at least some background in internet security. A lot of systems are very much not secure. So if you're really smart in those kind of ways, you can usually find avenues to get access to things if you really want to.
If you want the best hacking scene in a movie, I would go with Operation Swordfish. It's the John Travolta movie from like 25 years ago, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they had a guy they were trying to recruit, right? The hacker.
Mm-hmm.
So they tried to test him by putting a gun to his head and then having this hot woman next to him blow him while he does the hacking. Can you do it?
But why?
Like in terms of the plot, I think they were just trying to get him to prove himself to see if he could operate under pressure because they wanted him to do some kind of big job. I don't remember what it was.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the real reason they did it, just shits and giggles pretty much. I'm pretty sure the director was just having fun at that point.
Here's what we're going to do. But sir, why would anyone do that? That's like you're benefiting this person. Shh, it's for the scene. Shut up. No one asked you. Oh, people are saying Hugh Jackman is the hacker.
Oh, was he in there? Wow. It's been so long, I didn't even remember. Yeah, the only guy I remember in that movie was John Travolta.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would have been before the X-Men movies, so I probably didn't recognize him at the time. Hugh Jackman, that is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he basically just... To me, he's just Wolverine. That's kind of who I think of as far as actors who have played him.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I see him, that's what I think of.
Yeah, that's definitely his biggest role. He's a very, let's say, broadly skilled actor, too. He can sing and dance and do other things, too, not just superhero movies. There's a movie he's in called The Greatest Showman, which is more of the softer side of his acting ability, where he's not clawing people to death. It's more being a charismatic performer.
What was the Hack the Planet movie?
Hack the Planet!
Yeah.
I've seen the GIF, but I don't know what the movie is from.
Wait, you've never seen the movie?
Well, what is the movie? That is Hackers.
Fuck. Hack the Planet, alright. Wait, that wasn't the title of the movie. Hackers. That's the title of the movie, Hackers. Okay. I probably should have been able to remember that. Yeah, this is the one with Angelina Jolie in it. When she was like... I mean, she's always been hot, but she was like especially hot in this one. So I saw it when I was a teenager. You can probably tell. Yeah, that's a fun movie. It's not a good movie, but it's definitely a fun movie. I would definitely encourage you to give it a try.
Shut up and get in the car. What the hell? That's funny. The soundtrack of Hackers is incredible. Nice. I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, there you go. There's your assignment for Christmas break. 12 Angry Men and Hackers. Well, let's see. I think we had one more question. What do you think will happen with the Chinese lower class / working class if we go to war with them over Taiwan? I'm not sure what you mean. Nothing. I don't think anything would really happen. I mean, a war over Taiwan would probably be what's called a limited war. So I don't think it's going to be like a total war between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America, where they just fully mobilize their respective societies and go full tilt boogie to fight over the fate of Taiwan. probably they're just going to send a portion of their respective militaries to go and fight over it, however much they think is needed. But I don't think it's going to be total war. I'm not even sure you can even have total war, World War II style total war anymore. I'm not sure, given how complex supply chains have become, if that's even feasible. So I don't think like the Chinese working class would be drafted and then, forced to fight by the million against the United States war machine. I mean, even if they did, what would you use them for? Like, Taiwan is such a small territory. Like, how many millions of people do you even need to invade it? Fun. Actually, we've talked about this before. This is some fun trivia that maybe some people listening are not aware of. China's army is an all-volunteer force. They don't have conscription like, Russia or a lot of other countries do. I think there's like 2 weeks of training you have to do in high school, and that's pretty much it. Like, you don't have like vast, huge divisions of just conscripts in China. All of them are volunteers. And that's enough, right? Because there's a lot of poor people in China, and working for the military is a decent avenue for advancement for a lot of people. So they're never short of applicants. And so that's meant that they don't have to worry about trying to, teach everybody to learn how to teach everybody how to fight and try to maintain large standing forces of conscripts. They can actually very easily maintain large standing forces of volunteers. I could call them like professionals, but I kind of hesitate to do that because it's debatable. The Chinese army as an institution has a lot of problems with professionalism on a number of levels. So I don't know that they deserve the title necessarily, but it is an all-volunteer force, and that kind of underscores the fact that I don't think a war over Taiwan would necessarily involve just millions of working people in China. I think the Chinese government would plan the war in such a way that the volunteer forces they have on hand would probably be sufficient. I think at most they would draft people, just maybe some people as a contingency, to act as a reserve force to help out with, defending against American airstrikes or whatever.
Yeah, the fundamental I'm seeing here is the value of the normal, basically trained soldier goes down the more the crazy planes and bombs and other equipment become more advanced. Like I think you were saying World War II, one of the most limiting factors for countries was having trained pilots, which is a very specialized job. You have to understand how to operate an extremely expensive and dangerous transport and weapon. Whereas being able to walk around and hold a rifle is not a great level of specialization, and it's also a type of unit that's relatively easier to deal with than a fighter jet. So, yeah, you can have a large number of infantry on the ground, but what are they actually going to accomplish when they're up against the latest and greatest of military technology? It's not really the stat that matters the most anymore. Maneuver and logistics are things that are really, really important that most people don't talk about when they're theory crafting war. You have to think about the geography. You have to think about the economy that's backing up these countries, their equipment and the reserve equipment, their ability to get the equipment to the field, to move the right people around. And then, as we've seen with lots of military conflict, the chain of command and just the level of corruption in the military system. Are they able to do what the people up in the chain of command are telling them to do? And are they also being equipped with good enough gear? So there's a pretty big difference between just stating the fact of this country has a huge army versus like, what is the tech level of this army? What is the discipline level of the army? What is the ability for that army to get where it needs to go? And once they get there, how effective are they going to be based on the defensive setup that's there? So
well said.
Yeah, a bunch of 0-0 units are not going to be very effective when you've got area of effect damage stuff that didn't exist a long time ago in the past.
Gotcha.
We said you were pretty tired, and we're at about 2 hours, so if you wanted to wrap it up here, I'd be cool with that.
Well, did we have any more questions? I think you said some people, hadn't gotten them answered yet or something.
Oh, we caught up with them. I ended up banning the person who was whining about not getting their question answered. They were a repeat viewer, and I was kind of wondering, like, man, what they're saying seems very much like direct copy-pasted Russian propaganda. And I clicked their profile just to see their account age. And it's the same person who had a Nazi symbol as their Twitch profile. And I was like, oh, the person with the suspicious profile is back. And they were like, oh, well, I just have that because that's what NATO is. And it's like, okay. We're doubling down on the edginess here. I gave them an opportunity to be like, oh, I'm sorry if that was offensive, blah, 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 or do something like that. But no, they whined me about not getting the question. They whined about being sad that they were getting ignored. And then it turned out that they were doubling down on just direct, hateful Nazi propaganda. So goodbye. But everyone else has been well behaved, so good job, rest of chat.
Well, so it goes on the internet.
Yes.
Another day on the digital Serengeti.
Mm-hmm. Chat's pointing out the billions of tech versus the Taliban didn't do much either. Yeah, counterinsurgency is a tricky business, especially when defender's advantage is very large and when the attacker doesn't actually want to stay there. If people are defending their homes, that's a very strong force just in staying power. They want to be there, and it's hard to eliminate all hostiles in an area. So if they're defending their home and they're stubbornly staying there and fighting it out, yeah, they're going to be very resilient. So that's, I think, part of the credit of the human spirit, but then also the power of defender's advantage, and then just being able to defend your home turf and know the land really well, know the ins and outs of it.
So before we wrap up here, I was going to ask you, you've got this list of things on your Twitch stream. Are these all things that people asked you to do?
Yes, some of them were suggestions from others, some I thought of myself. Yeah, they're different goals that we unlock as we get more subscriptions through the subathon.
Oh, okay. I understand.
Yeah. The Baldur's Gate 3 run that we started was actually one of the goals we unlocked in the last one in June. So we've been, gradually chipping away at that. But I hadn't really gotten the idea to do that with you until I was kind of in that mental exploration of like, what would be a fun type of content to share with people that I haven't done before that would be a cool collab. So
Gotcha.
You ended up being a guest on that, and we still have a honor mode run that's alive in Act 3.
Yeah, we're making progress. Well, I was going to ask if is this stuff people can suggest?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have a
Could
suggestion?
I suggest Alpha Centauri?
The game?
Yeah.
Sure. Let me see what
I
that...
actually would genuinely enjoy watching you play that.
Let me see what it costs on Steam.
Actually, I would recommend... Well, you can get it on Steam, but it might be cheaper on Good Old Games.
Alpha Centauri Space Force? Or Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri?
Sid Meier. Definitely Sid Meier.
Alpha Centauri Planetary Pack. It's $5. Yeah. Cool. Mankind begins its most monumental task, the colonization of space. A crew of internationally renowned scientists and security strategists with wide-ranging convictions and diverse ethics embarks on a mission that will change the world. One planet, 7 unique factions. Which will you lead? Each faction has its own agenda, each leader a final goal. You must play to each strength and exploit each hidden weakness in your quest to rule the future. Oh, so this is like if we got to the next star over, how would we manage that?
Yeah, it's a Civ-style 4X builder.
Huh.
But it's unique in that it also has kind of an in-game story, and it's actually pretty good. And it's very, very sci-fi, like hard sci-fi in nature, so I think you in particular would enjoy it.
What year is it from?
Oh, it's an older one. It's like 98, 99, something like that.
Nice, a throwback. I did play a throwback of Age of Mythology. They released the Retold game. It's basically revamping all the graphics of Age of Mythology. It was pretty fun. It's got a lot of the same notes as Age of Empires, where it's the more classical format of Greeks and Egyptians and all that kind of stuff. But Age of Mythology specifically also adds in gods. So managing favor with your deity and then unlocking their god powers is another way to get advantages in a situation. You can buff your stuff and increase your population or whatever with your god, or you could zap people if Zeus is your deity and that kind of thing. I was having a blast like moving the workers around between the mines and the farms and going to the church and praying to God and stuff, and joking about how the workers probably much prefer to be working at church as their assignment rather than tilling the land or like in the mines dealing with all the smoke and stuff. Oh, please don't take me back to the mines. I want to stay at church.
That sounds pretty good. What was it called?
Age of Mythology Retold.
Age of Mythology. It's one of those games I've heard about, but never actually played. Definitely take a look at that. Okay. Well, thank you for indulging me.
Hell yeah.
Is this it, or did you want to do BG3? I notice you've only got 30 minutes left, and I don't know how much money you're going to get from people wanting to watch me play BG3.
Yeah, let's get a vibe check from chat. What do you say, chat? What do you think the odds are that we keep going? Because I can also StarCraft it up, which is our main bread and butter. Any strong opinion havers, you may speak. Also, any people lurking in the audience. 50-50, you either will or you won't. This man is God. Whatever he wants is fine with me. Do you mean our guest? You like him? I guess they were very happy with your response to their question.
You are way more godlike than me. You've got the physique. You've got the physique carved from bronze. My physique is carved from jello.
A cut of the jello cloth. Chat says hit the 1998 game. I could do.
Alpha Centauri.
Yeah, I could do that for a little bit. I think that'd be funny.